Thanks, John. I'm Pamela Pelletier. I'm the new VP for activities, and it's because of Ron, actually, that I'm here. He was on another nominating committee that was responsible for finding new people to come in and help out, and he came up with me, and I'm here. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm looking forward to working with all of you this year. I've had a great time at Pecos meeting many of you, and I'm really excited to introduce Ron tonight. Not only did he obviously nominate me for taking on this position, but then I turned around and said, great, you get to be our first speaker for the lineup, which worked out pretty well for me. I work with Ron at the Tree Ring Lab, and it's been great the 6 years that I've been there to really get to know him and to understand his research interest. So tonight I'm really excited to see him present on the Aztec Ruins and the work he's been doing with the great houses. Ron joined the lab in 1990, and he got his PhD in 1997, so you do the math. And he's been there a little while, but it's amazing work. And before I turn it over to Ron, I actually do want to do a plug for this Saturday. We are, as part of our activities that we offer for ARC and HIS, we have field trips. And this month's field trip is, of course, coming to the Tree Ring Lab, because I figured let's just do it all at once. It all ties in well together. And so this Saturday at 10, we still have space, and we have a special lecture by Dr. Jeff Dean, and then we're going to take you behind the scenes through the Tree Ring Lab. So if you're interested, just contact me. We still have space. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ron to go ahead and talk to us about the Aztec great houses. He's an archaeologist and a dendrochronologist, and he's really interested in wood procurement, and he's going to tell us all about this latest work. Thanks.
Thanks, Pamela. You know what, John? I think I'll just hang out here if that works for you.
Yep.
Because I also figured out earlier that my head's too big for these things. You know, that's what happens when you get a big head. So thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. Are we doing light anything? No? Yes? No? That's fine. Well, I just didn't know if you wanted to.
No, we want to turn
screen,
these
the
lights.
screen better.
These lights up.
Yeah.
Go ahead and talk.
Okay. Well, as you know, my name is Ron Towner. I am an associate professor of anthropology and dendrochronology. I work predominantly at the Tree Ring Lab, Laboratory of Tree Ring Research here at the U of A, and my employment is split. The other half of it is in the School of Anthropology. And one thing, stop me anytime if you have questions, but I'm fairly informal. Been involved with ARC and HIS for some little time now, since I came as a grad student, got involved my first or second year in grad school here, and it's a great organization, and I'm glad to be back. Don't know how many times I've talked, and if you can't hear me, make sure and wave your arms or something and tell me. Tonight I want to talk about a kind of a new project and a new approach, and it's not just mine. The first thing I have to say is my colleague Chris Gitterman at the Tree Ring Lab, or formerly at the Tree Ring Lab, he just got a new job and moved to Maine, I think, in the past month. But was really the one who spearheaded a lot of this, and it's a new approach in the United States to sourcing where trees came from, where timbers and archaeological sites came from. And I'll get into that more later if I can figure out the workings of there we go. Okay, so we're going to start off with sort of the overview, sort of the outline of what I'm going to talk about. And how many of you have been to Aztec? Wow, almost everybody. So, you know, what's, uh-oh. No, that's not it. Sorry, John. The pointer wasn't.
Yeah, okay.
Is it on the side?
The pointer is the central button.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, well, if you've been to Aztec, you know what this is. This is the Great Black Stripe on the west wall of Aztec. Not an archaeologist or Puebloan archaeologist anywhere in the Southwest who doesn't recognize what this is. But for my purposes here, it's the background. So what I want to tell you about is first off the sort of motivation and the origins of how this all got started. And we can sort of trace it back to the early 1980s, but we'll update it. And then talk about the technique, which is what we call tree ring width-based sourcing. So it's a completely different technique. It's been used in Europe quite a bit, but Chris's work with the great houses in Chaco Canyon is the first time it's been used in the States. And so I'll give you a little bit of background from the great houses that are in the canyon, because that's important context for how did things change between those sites that are in Chaco Canyon, Bonito and things like that, and Aztec. And so it's going to take me a long time. Bear with me. We'll get to Aztec. Okay. So since most of you have been there, you know the Chaco world between 850 and 1240, something like that. The San Juan Basin of northwestern New Mexico, but extending all the way into. There we go. It's sort of working. There it was. Well, extending west into Arizona. Yeah, that line not quite as far as the Hopi Mesas. Depends on who you talk to, how far. Some people stretch it to Wapatki. I don't go that far. And south to Zuni, north into southwestern Colorado, southeastern Utah. And one of the interesting things is really not very far east, and we will see that crop up again and again. So, one of the things about Chaco is there's lots of wood in these great houses. So in the canyon, the 12 great houses in the canyon, they had lots and lots of wood. This picture on the left is a picture from National Geographic. I think that's Judd's excavations in the 1920s. And you could see those timbers sitting there in this, and this is one of the rooms of Bonito. Then I'm going to have to use that. No, that doesn't work. Here, this is a room in Pueblo Bonito right there as well. That's a typical Chacoan roof. You've got these two really big beams, what we at the Tree Ring Lab would call primary beams, and then these secondary beams that come in from the sides and overlap. And then you've got matting and earth and clay and stuff that forms the roof up there. And that's a real typical Chaco roof. And there's nothing else like it in the Southwest. No one else built rooms this big. And one of the things about Chaco is these masonry rooms, you had to have beams that straight and that long to span those rooms. No one else needed, none of the other Puebloan folks, ancestral Puebloans or anybody else in that area was making rooms this big. They didn't need logs like this. Chacoans needed logs like that. I put this one on down here, one at the bottom, only because it shows you sort of a close-up of beams at Chaco, and this is again at Pueblo Bonito. Looks like stone axe cut beams. That's one of the things we use to identify stone axe cut beams. Has everybody seen, have people been to Chaco and seen this, been to Pueblo Bonito and seen these? Yeah. So some of you had, yeah. Don't believe it. The Park Service never tells you this. I put this in there just because I find it really amusing. Yes, those are flattened ends. Gordon Vivian put those in Pueblo Bonito in the stabilization in the 1950s and used a ball peen hammer to beat the ends up so they look like they're stone axe cut. It was all about presentation. Okay, so there's another sort of shot of the Chaco room. The important thing about this, or the relative thing about this, is if you see there, over there, that hole in that beam, it's where someone took a tree ring sample. You can see a couple more on these secondaries up in here. There's one hidden behind there. I think I've got some better shots in the next one. But so Jeff Dean was part of the Chaco Kettle project in the late 70s, early 80s. Jeff Dean and another guy at the Trim Lab, Dick Warren, cored Chaco Kettle every beam they could. And Jeff tells a great story about this. But in the end of it, they estimated that in those 12 great houses, there were probably 240,000 trees that were used in those 12 great houses in Chaco Canyon. So one of the questions, and this has been a question, actually since the early days of Chaco, not just 83. 83 was just the first time anybody sort of quantified it. This is looking down on Pueblo Bonito from the trail that goes up to New Alta. What don't you see in that picture is the important thing. You don't see any trees. Yeah, there's a few scraggly little junipers up there on South Mesa and things like that. There are cottonwoods in Chaco Wash. They're actually pretty impressive cottonwoods because the wash is in size, it's down cut by about 30 feet. So you're just seeing the tops of it. Cottonwoods are crappy construction material. You don't build with cottonwood because it's not a weight bearing timber. So there aren't trees around Chaco. So early on in the days of excavations at Chaco, like Neil Judd, wondered where did all this wood come from? Now, Neil Judd hypothesized that there was a ponderosa forest out there, because, they didn't sample the trees because tree dating was not actually invented yet. It was just in its infancy of being invented. But they were still wondering about all that wood, and he thought there was a remnant forest out there, and the Chacoans must have denuded the entire landscape. So that was Judd's idea. And, there were a couple of trees out there, although this tree that this guy's standing on, we've looked for it. Actually, Chris went back and tried to find these beams that were in the slopes along parts of the canyon, and they don't exist anymore. But looking at that tree, that certainly wasn't growing when Chacoans were living there. Just my experience with that sort of tree, I'll bet was less than 100 years old when that picture was taken. And it was dying then, and it's long gone now. So there was that idea that the Chacoans had denuded the landscape building these. Well, so then in the 1980s, the early 1980s, somebody who a lot of you may know, Julio Betancourt, started working with Paul S. Martin and a lot of other things, and Julio went out and collected packrat middens. Now, if you're not familiar with packrat middens, they're really fascinating things. Packrats, I heard somebody talking, I guess it was Paul at dinner, complaining about the packrats in your garage, in the alley that get in your engine in your car, right? We've had that. Well, but they're fascinating because they only go about 100 feet, or some small range from their nest, and they do what packrats do, right? They collect stuff. Well, and they live in the same spot for literally generations. And they urinate and defecate, and that then evaporates and solidifies into what we call amber rat. And that's what Julio is holding here, is a big packrat midden that is solid. And what you can do then is date the organic material with radiocarbon dating that's in the packrat midden, and you can identify it. So what Julio did, Julio and Tom Van Devender and some other folks did that, and it's not just one packrat midden, but a lot. But the critical ones are from Atlatl Cave, and so Julio shows through a lot of this packrat, a lot of work on the packrats, is that this is the vegetation in the Chaco Canyon. Now, if you haven't seen a graph like this, let me explain it a little bit. From bottom to top, so the bottom here over on the left, we won't worry about the archaeological phase stuff. It's the years that are important. The sort of second column So you go back 6,000 years ago, and that's based on radiocarbon dates. And then all these lines here, these sort of battleship curves, are different vegetation. So, you know, on the far left, you've got spruce, you've got Rocky Mountain juniper, which is Juniperus, what is it called? Scopianorum, Douglas fir, ponderosa, all that stuff. And then over on the right-hand side here, you see desert scrub plants, you know, sagebrush, rabbitbrush, four-wing saltbush, stuff like that. Well, the really critical thing from our perspective, let's see if this comes in. During the Chaco period, so I don't even care how long or short we make it, there were no trees. There were no Douglas firs, there were no ponderosas. There were no spruce trees in Chaco Canyon. There haven't been for at least 5,000 years, and probably more like, 8,000 years. There were a few Utah junipers, some piñons, and you can see right at the end there, Chacoan folks may have seriously impacted the piñon forest and the juniper forest for firewood and things like that, but they weren't using it for construction material. So all the trees that they were getting had to come from somewhere else. They weren't present in the canyon at all. Okay, so all of those trees, and we had initially, and I'm not sure we actually have identified this positively, but we had Douglas fir, and then there was something that was for a long time called species X. Because it's really difficult until we got a scanning electron microscope or looked at this stuff under a scanning electron microscope, just a normal binocular microscope, distinguishing between spruce, particularly Engelmann spruce, and white fir, we just couldn't do it. Now we've done it with the SEM, so we now identified spruce up there. So the trees that they're using in Chaco are, the big trees for roofing are predominantly ponderosa pines, Douglas fir, with a few spruce thrown in, and a few white fir thrown in. So Julio and Jeff Dean and Herb Hull then published an article in 1986, I think it is, talking about where these trees came from, that long distance transport. So they had to come from at least 80 kilometers away. Somewhere you see there's Chaco in the middle of the San Juan Basin, and they had to come from these areas around here. You know, these are because those trees grow above 2,500 meters, usually somewhere in that range, certainly about 2,000 meters. And you can see the elevations surrounding the San Juan Basin. So the Chuscas, the Zunis, Mount Taylor, the Jemez, you know, what gets called, you'll see various names of the Jemez, the Nacimientos and the San Mateos, up by Mesa Verde, and the San Juan Mesa, San Juan Mountains in southwestern Colorado. All of those things have elevations where they can get Douglas fir and spruce trees, and certainly ponderosas. Then, in the early 2000s, a new technique got involved. And part of, let me step back just a second here. Part of the interesting, I think, aspect of this was at the same time in the early 80s is when side-looking radar and low-level photography really started identifying the Chaco road system. Before that, there were some people who'd seen the roads, but had no idea how extensive they were. And this map is actually a very poor representation of that. Chaco roads now, we know they go into southeast Utah. They're discontinuous at times, but so people really did start putting these things together, and one of the explanations for the roads was, oh, move those timbers into Chaco on the roads. So that was, you know, one of the explanations for the roads. Whether it's good or not, I don't think so. Anyway, so then in the early 2000s, again, Julio and Jeff, and a student by the name of Nathan English came up with a new technique to source timbers. And it was isotopic analysis of strontium in the rings. And I won't go into it a lot, except to say that different kinds of soil, different kinds of bedrock had different ratios of strontium 87 to 86. And so those different mountain ranges would have different ratios. So the trees take that stuff up when they grow, and they fix it in their rings as they grow. So, excuse me, so you could potentially source the timbers that way. And that's what Nathan did. And then 5 years later, 4 years later, Amanda Ronald, another grad student, expanded on that. And so here's Nathan's description. These are the living trees, so distinguishing between the living trees and water. Water becomes an important component of this, testing the water. And then here were the timbers. So most of the timbers that Nathan looked at were clearly not from the Nacimientos. They were from the Chuscas, maybe down at Mount Taylor, Mount Taylor, the San Mateo Mesas, that area. And for some reason, this shocked a lot of people. I don't know, Jeff and I kind of looked at each other and said, well, duh. Chaco never looked east. The only thing that comes into Chaco from the east is turquoise from the Cerrillos mines near Santa Fe, between Santa Fe and Albuquerque. There's not pottery, there's nothing else that came into Chaco. And we still don't know what went out of Chaco much at all. Although I'm not a Chaco scholar, so don't hold me to any of that. Okay, so then, so that was bad. And then just to make it different, Amanda had a different kind of map. Here's the same sort of thing. On the top are the modern trees, and on the bottom are timbers from here. There's 4 great houses in the canyon. Remember, these are all in Chaco Canyon. And so what you can see is most stuff certainly looks like it was coming from the Chuscas. There's a little bit of overlap with the La Platas, maybe a little bit in the San Juans, but the real problem then, so we've got all of those. The real problem with especially the modern samples was distinguishing between samples in Chaco Canyon and the Chuscas. They overlapped so much that you couldn't really say, going back to that original idea, you couldn't really say, oh, they didn't come from the canyon. That you couldn't say definitively they came from the Chuscas. So that created a whole bunch of questions just about where they are. And part of that, in those intervening sort of decade, people looking at strontium, looking at sourcing a lot more, figured out that a lot of the strontium in soils in various mountain ranges is in the form of dust. It gets blown around, so it gets mixed. It wasn't as clear cut as we initially thought of saying, oh, this spot here is different than that spot there. And lo and behold, the winds are predominantly in the west on the Colorado Plateau. The Chuscas are due west of Chaco. So a lot of that stuff out of Chaco could have originated in the Chuscas. We don't know. So anyway, that created some additional questions. So that brings us to this project. I need to keep track of myself here. And so what we're doing now, like I said, is a new technique, new to the US, sort of imported from Europe, and it's about measuring rings. And these are all samples from Chetro, well, not all. So the CK on the samples is Chetrokettle. The JPB is Pueblo Bonito for Judd's Pueblo Bonito, and the PBLs are also Pueblo Bonito. So we have all these samples. That's why we don't throw anything away. You can tell you that. These are things. Some of the originals that that were in this analysis were some of the original samples that Neil Judd sent to Andrew Lockett Douglas in the 1920s. That we still have in the lab and still reused for other kinds of analysis. So we're going to take a little bit of just a slight detour to sort of give you the background to help understand this. So not every tree dates. And tree ring dating doesn't work everywhere. But why does it work when it works? Well, two things. Trees are these natural archives of information. They stand in one place. You know, trees don't run around the landscape. And they stand in one place for a really long time. You know, they can be standing in the same place for hundreds of years, absorbing information from the environment. So be that precipitation, temperature, isotopic stuff in the soil, all sorts of things like that. They also reflect past use of people. So that's where anthropology comes in. You know, that's really what I'm interested in. It's not the dates, it's the behavior of the people that really interests me. But so trees are these natural archives. And in general, and these are sort of general rules, the growth of the rings is controlled by precipitation at lower elevations. At higher elevations or high latitudes, so keep that in mind, it's generally controlled by temperature, which is why tree rings play a major role in all the studies of climate change, and especially tree rings up around the Arctic Circle, near the Arctic Circle. They're being controlled by temperature. To southwest, it's precipitation. Now, in order to, let me see what's next. The thing about that, though, is microenvironments can affect all of that. So we need to look at, when we build chronologies, what we're really looking at is tree populations. So, you know, example would be, we can create chronologies of trees that don't date. It may be that this particular tree, if it's growing right next to the stream, it's not lacking for water. It's not dependent on that precipitation for ring growth. It's got water in the stream. So when we build chronologies, we actually look for trees that are they're on steep slopes, gravelly slopes elsewhere. We have all sorts of criteria for that. But, so those are the populations, those are the chronologies we build is from those populations. And let me see, then I think you probably have almost all seen this. You know, it's the pattern of those wide and narrow rings, the pattern of those dry years in the Southwest that allows us to carry the dating back in time. You know, Andrew Alcott Douglas started with living trees, and then he went to stumps when Flagstaff area was being logged, and then went to old buildings and standing dead snags, and anything like that. That's the way we build chronologies. Well, so now we have these chronologies, and we have, since Douglas's time, you know, I don't even know how many chronologies we have in the Southwest. It's in the thousands. It really is. In part, I mean, I don't know how many, you probably have 100 or more up on Mount Lemmon, just because every fall the introductory to dendrochronology class goes up there and corns trees and builds a chronology. But everyone is useful. But for our purposes, we're looking at around the San Juan Basin and in northwestern New Mexico. And we've got all these chronologies, and these are now measured chronologies. I'll talk about that in a minute. All these will cross-date with each other. I mean, in general, because the same climatic pattern is affecting all of those. A wet year in Mesa Verde is typical a wet year in Gallup or Zuni. I used to live up there. A wet year in the Chiscas is a wet year up by Farmington. Now, the absolute amounts of moisture are different. You know, the Chiscas are always going to be wetter than Farmington. But the relative amount throughout an annual cycle is the same. Dry years, we see this down here. It even affects down here, but we see it especially up there. When it's a drought, everyone's in a drought. You know, there's not enough spatial variability, really, to see that. But the interesting thing about this measure of the tree rings is, yes, they all will cross-date with each other, but there's enough just enough variability between them that we can identify trees to those specific areas. So we know, and I'll use examples that from my own research a lot up what's called the Gubernador area. 1748 is just, it's the worst year in our reconstruction in the last 1,500 and some odd years, going back into the 500s. It's bad everywhere, but it's not the worst year down in Zuni. There, I forget what is in Zuni. I think it's 1848 is the worst year in Zuni. So, there's enough variation that each one of these signals is unique. They match each other, and so we can do the dating, but they're unique. So that's the trick. We then take, so let me see here. So in order to do that, if I won't go back, but think about those cross sections I showed you. We measure each and every ring on those samples under a microscope to the 100th of an inch. Thank God for work study students and undergraduates. Undergraduate work study students, they can do it. And we do that for each chronology. So we've got at least 20 trees and 40 samples, so 40 cores of their core samples, 2 different radii on a cross section for doing that. So we end up with, for a typical chronology, something like 80,000 measured rings, something like that. So we can then take those and we do some statistics to eliminate the growth curve and stuff like that on them. And we get a standardized graph that looks something like this thing on the top up here. So you've got let me see if I can get the next one up. So you've got the black line is a particular sample. The red line is all those other average samples from a particular chronology. And we can see then statistically, does that sample match those other samples? And we get, so the one here has an R of correlation of 0.74, which is really pretty high. And another statistic we use is the t-values, which I don't like all that much, but we use them. It varies in different contexts. Anything over a value of 10, we think is the exact same tree. So here, in this particular example, we've got a value of T13.5. So pretty confident that timber comes from, it reflects exactly the growth patterns of other trees that come from that specific area. But one of the things about all these correlation coefficients, and it's not just in this particular example, but in others that I get nervous about, here's another one. Same thing, same timber, different source area. Well, here the correlation is 0.51. You see down here in the corner, down here. And the t-value is 7.2. So that's less. This kind of statistical analysis is going to give you an answer. It's going to say, and we could list another probably 3 source areas with lower correlations. What I get nervous about is, if they are fairly close, say, 0.65 and a 0.68, that means the archaeologist gets to choose the one that he likes better, which I am always nervous about. But anyway, that's kind of basically the way the technique works. Is lots of measuring, lots of samples, and then correlation coefficients of those ring series. Okay, so then again, Chris Bitterman, who deserves lots of the credit, for all the credit for this work, went out and tested sites near Chaco Canyon, the living tree sites he was testing to see if he could identify those. So went out and collected more samples, did more measuring, and so was able to, see, are we coming in here? So getting samples from all these places, come on, Chris. And so he looked at these, and it's one of our problems is we can't just use those living trees, right? Because our living trees don't go back in time far enough. We have to build the chronologies through in this particular case, the Chaco period. So we're looking at the exact same time frame and the exact same climatic signals in different areas. So that's where we had to use the existing collections, and that's why the collection of the tree lab is just so valuable, is we can keep using it. Well, I'm going to come back to this one in Gubernador, kind of at the end, because it's one that I'll tell you now, I just don't trust for a couple of reasons. Okay, so does it work? Yes, Chris was able to source trees to a number of those different mountain ranges. And then he and Tom Swetnam and Jeff Dean published in the Proceedings of the National Academy in 2015, 14, something like that. And looked at both the long distance transport and the sources of the wood. And remember, we haven't even gotten to Aztec yet. This is still in the canyon. And so just the dating, we can see here the number of trees. I'm going to skip through this. The important thing about this is when we go select which timbers we want to use in the analysis, which are archaeological timbers, we want samples that have cutting dates. So that means the outside of the tree, so it had bark or something that indicates the outside of the tree. We have to have enough rings. First off, we need enough rings to date the trees, but also if we're doing correlations like that, if you took 15 rings, don't correlate highly with any place else on the chronology. They just will, because you've got such a small sample size. So we wanted samples that had more than 30 rings. Actually, we prefer more than 50 if we can get them, or more than 75 rings if we can get them. And we haven't yet gotten good enough to do this with charcoal. We have lots of our samples are charcoal. We're working on that. So anyway, Chris's work in Chaco Canyon itself, we've got 170 of those beams, 3/4 of them Ponderosa, and mostly from just those three great houses, Tetrapel, Lido, and Pueblo del Arroyo. So where did they come from? Here's the percentages. So this is most of them from Chaco Canyon itself, so not quite half, but 42% coming from the Chusca Mountains. Surprised almost everybody, I think, that a big chunk were coming from the Zuni Mountains, coming from the south, which is unusual. You know, a little bit from Mount Taylor. Again, nothing really from the east, the 3 and the 4% over in the Hemis. The Gubernador, that 5 is probably, should be pushed a little bit. And a little bit from the north, but mostly, you know, south and west. So again, it also shows Chaco's not looking east. It agreed pretty much with the strontium isotope analysis, with the exception of, I don't think either Amanda or Nathan had looked at the Zunis, so they weren't including Zuni in their strontium studies. So that's where most of those timbers came from. Okay, and the interesting part about this is the Chuscas dominate everywhere. Chris likes to point out, that the Zuni region dominates prior to about AD 1000. I like to point out that that's a total of 10 trees. So, you know, if you're looking at percentages or numbers, so, you know, co-authors, we can disagree, that's all right, no problem with that. Okay, but Then by the mid-1000s, and that's when Chaco was really expanding, is the mid-1000s. I mean, Chaco grows throughout the, throughout the 900s into the 1000s, but it really expands in the mid-1000s through the early 1100s. Okay, so same thing happens. What we see with flakestones, so up there to the left is Novana Pass Chert. Ceramics, trachyte tempered ceramics are coming from the Chusca. Novana Pass is in the Chuscas. That's a very distinct flakestone material. The timber in the pottery, lots of Chaco pottery, is a trachyte tempered pottery that comes from the Chusca Mountains, comes from the Chusca Slope, the east slope of the Chuscas, and timbers. So we see Chaco really oriented toward that area and not the east. Okay, so finally, in the last 15 minutes here, we get to Aztec. Now, so, Aztec, this map isn't the best, but its original name was Aztec on the Animas. It's on the Animas River, right near Aztec, New Mexico. That's the name. And so north of the San Juan, fairly close to the Colorado border. Aztec is, 20 miles, maybe 20 miles from the Colorado border. It's 39 miles. I've driven it enough, I know. It's 39 miles to Durango. So it's close to southwestern Colorado. And a long ways from Chaco Canyon itself. So briefly, Aztec is, again, like you probably know, it's the descendant one of the descendant cultural centers from Chaco. It's occupied. Andrew Douglas identified this before he knew dates that Aztec was built after Benito. So Aztec, certainly it takes over as the great houses in the canyon sort of wax or wane. Aztec is growing. The western Aztec is two ruins. You don't see the east ruin very often. There are two great houses up there, East Ruin and West Ruin. Earl Morris excavated the West Ruin in 1916 to 1927. If you've been to Aztec, if you haven't, you have to go, and you have to go into the Great Kiva. It's the only roofed Great Kiva in the Southwest. And even if Earl took a little liberty with what he interpreted, that's okay. It's still a really cool place. So some of the first samples that Douglas dated were collected by Earl Morris from Aztec at the behest of Clark Whistler. Now, Morris suggested these two different occupations, one at west and then a later one at east. And most people there thought, oh, those timbers they're relatively local. So, again, here I'm standing on West Ruin somewhere, I don't know where, but what do you see there? You don't see ponderosa and Douglas fir and spruce. You see a lot of juniper trees, and you see cottonwoods in the foreground. Same story, there's not a lot of timbers. Here, I'm looking I'm looking at the back wall, the north wall of Aztec, and looking north, and there aren't trees there either. There aren't any trees. So Aztec, despite being it's in a riparian area, but there aren't good construction timbers. So yeah, go see the Great Key. Just a little shot of typical core and veneer masonry. No one else does that except Chacoans anywhere in the Southwest. This is in one of those back rooms at Aztec. Again, really typical Chacoan roof. One don't have a pair this time, but a single large primary beam and a bunch of paired, those are sets of three secondary beams overlying it. Same thing with window lintels, there's lots of stuff like that. Here, I threw this one in because I want you to see that cork. And again, I can't go right up there to the last one. That says GP 63. Can you see it on this better? Anyway, if you see those things up there in the ruins, and this is in one of those back rooms, that's Gila Pueblo. So that's a place, and I think they've replaced the cork, but when we core trees, or core archaeological beams, we fill the hole with a cork with the sample number on it. And Gila Pueblo, Harold Gladwin did that as well. So poor Aztec, there have been lots of people collected at Aztec, but so you see, we can see the Gila Pueblo cores somewhere in here. I thought one of ours, we have smaller tools, so ours aren't quite as big, but that's all right. So again, same collection. This is one of the samples that Morris collected in 1919. He collected a cross section. We took a core out of that because it's easier for us. Okay, so when Chris and I started on this project, we look at everything that we had in the training lab. We've got, almost 5,000 samples from Aztec. I say Aztec's been collected probably more than any other site in the Southwest, mostly because of a guy by the name of Tom Wise. I don't know if you all know Tom, but Tom's been to Aztec. I don't know, he spent half his life collecting Aztec. We got more than 1,200 dates from Aztec, so dated samples, so it's really well dated. So then we went through and looked at, again, the same sourcing criteria. We wanted more than 30 rings. We wanted cutting and near cutting dates. So of those, 699 samples met our criteria. And you can see where these come from. A lot from the west, and the west is predominantly juniper, with some ponderosa, not much Douglas fir. East Ruin is almost all juniper, you can see here. And, you know, one of the sort of amusing things, I enjoy doing this, we have samples from the visitor center. Well, that's because when they built the visitor center, they reused beams from the ruin. This is the early days of the Park Service, right? So we get to discover these things. They say, date this, and go, well, it dates to the 1100s. And the Park Service wasn't here in the 1100s. So, and then there were a bunch that what we call unknown. They were a wood pile. We don't know who piled them up and where they collected them from. So, but that's all right. So yeah, here we go. We've got duplicates in here. So we ended up with 363 measured beams. And here we go, ponderosa and juniper in the 1100s up to 1120, mostly. And then predominantly juniper with a few Douglas firs thrown in the 1200s. So the early occupation is predominantly ponderosa, a little bit of Douglas fir, and some juniper and some other stuff down there. The late occupation is predominantly juniper. So we're talking, really what we're talking about is east and west ruins, or west being earlier, east being later. So we ended up with 329 samples, 319 are attributed to the source areas. And here's our chronologies. I'm just putting those up here. We won't belabor the point, but you can see all the way around. We actually added a couple. I thought I added that to this slide. Oh well. We added a couple more in southeastern Utah, Beef Basin, Canyon de Chelly, Malpai, added some stuff down there. So of all the beams, when we just look at all of them, this is what we see. Almost half come from the Chustas, more come from the Mesa Verde area, a few come from the Durango area, and then 14% right there is what's labeled Gubernador. What you don't see is Zulu. You don't see, unlike Benito and unlike those ruins in the canyon, those great houses, we don't see stuff coming up from Zulu. Juniper, surprisingly enough, to us anyway, we thought, all the juniper's local. Yeah, you can go up to Cedar Hill. That's why it's called Cedar Hill. It's covered with juniper. It's not very far away. But a third of it comes from, there's a lot of juniper from the Mesa Verde area. But a third of it comes from the Chuscas. And then there's 20% of the junipers, and again, this is the late occupation, listed in that Gubernador chronology. Ponderosa, real different. 3/4 of it, so this is the early section, right? 3/4 of it comes from the Chusca Mountains. And not much else, a little bit from, this is actually the Mancos area, not the Mesa Verde area, Mancos chronology, and a little bit from the Gubernador area. So I'm going to step back just a second here to talk about this Gubernador area, because it'll show up again. But I said we have to build the chronologies with both living trees and then archaeological wood. That's where this becomes a problem, because, and Chris, when he first showed me this, I just looked at him and said, there's no way, Chris. I don't care what your statistics say. I mean, you can tell I'm not a big statistics guy, right? I don't care. I have spent a lot of my professional life wandering around that part of the country, and there are no Pueblo 2 or Pueblo 3 sites. There are no, I've never even seen P2 sherds out there. And he's like, oh, maybe they went out to get trees and just didn't carry pots with them. No, there are no sites out there. I think what's going on there is that our archaeological chronology that we use to build that long chronology contains wood from lots of sites that are, they just sort of got lumped into, this is the Gubernador area. But a bunch of them, I think, are closer to Aztec, to Cedar Hill. And the dot on the map gets put actually pretty far east of the Gubernador area, a place called Pueblito Canyon, because that's where the living trees came from. And I know there's nothing there in Pueblito Canyon. And actually, that part of the world has had one of the largest sort of archaeological projects in the past 30 years, the Fruitland Project. There have been surveys, there have been excavations, there have been lots of stuff out there. A real boon to the Navajo archaeology, but nothing. There's some P1, there's a little bit of P1, there's Vasconcelos stuff out there, but there's no Pueblos 2 or 3 stuff out there in the Gubernador. So I think that's one of the issues with our statistical analysis. Okay, so again, if we look at the 1100s, the early stuff, again, Chuscas, a little bit from elsewhere. 1200s, it really shifts. That late shift, that late occupation at Aztec really stops looking at the Chuscas and is really concentrated in Mesa Verde and areas north. Mesa Verde, 12% is Mancos, so we're able to distinguish those. The 13%, again, I think, even though that says Gubernador, I think it's a lot more closer to Cedar Hill, things like that, probably north of the San Juan River instead of south like the dot shows. So we have a real shift in Aztec, and that's reflected in lots of other things as well. Yeah, you've just seen this. I don't think you've seen that. So we'll come up to, this is one of Chris's pictures, I just love it. How did all those beams get there anyway? Well, I can't explain that. I guess that tree is really a fast-growing young tree. I don't know. I'm not even sure where it is. Anyway, the sort of conventional notions that you've seen, and Kiva played an important role in this a couple of times. Snigg and Wines had a 1998 article. National Geographic shows, it shows people carrying these beams using, it wasn't Dave Wilcox, but somebody else even hypothesized that the roads were that wide because that's how many, the Chaco roads, which, are uniform width, straight things. They had to be that wide to accommodate, however many it was, 4 people on each side of one of these beams so that they could march these beams up and down the landscape to Chaco. Well, then just recently, last year, an article in Kiva suggested a different strategy of rolling logs down other logs as a strategy for that. Well, Chris came up with these pictures, and I like them. Here we go. Just because old fat white guys like me can't carry stuff like this doesn't mean it can't be done. Sherpas and people who live on the landscape, walking everywhere, this probably wasn't that big a deal. And we always talk about, oh, the average distance a person can walk in a day is 12 miles. If you're walking every day, 12 miles is probably it's a walk in the park, literally. I remember talking here, people looking at the Tucson Basin. God, how long did it take to cross the Tucson Basin? No, people probably left West Branch, went up to Gibbon Springs and back in a day. Or maybe they overnighted, but it wasn't a big deal. Not as big a deal as we make it. So, I'll just leave you with that thoughts. Well, a couple of thoughts. We have to conclude. But one of these things are these ties to landscapes that I think is really important. People knew the landscapes and they had long cultural ties to the landscape that lasted 4 generations. And, I'll just put these up here because we talked about them already, talked them to death, sort of. Things changed differently, and they're different between East and West, East Ruin and West Ruin. Okay, now I got to thank the people who give us money, like Chaco, Aztec, and WNPA, and National Science Foundation, and especially Chris Gitterman. Right? This is predominantly a lot of his work. Jeff Dean, Alec measures a lot of tree rings. I think that's one of his goals toward. I think he's going to graduate this spring, and one reason he wants to get out of measuring tree rings for $12 an hour or whatever it is. And my colleague Ben Bellarado, who I saw earlier tonight, but he probably skipped out because he got bored. So, any questions, comments? I know I've kept you late. So.
Well, so why the Chuskas?
I think they were as close as any, and they had roads all the way around and through the Chuskas. I don't know. Maybe it was a combination of, you had good temper for your pottery, you had good flake stone material, and you had trees. So you could get 3 birds with 1 stone, or something like that. Although we think they probably had special crews to go up there and harvest the trees. I think not just anybody could go up there and do it. But again, we haven't found any. There's a few places up there where we found stone axes, but we've never found. They've decayed. We've never found stumps up there. Stone axe dead stumps. Everybody I know goes up there and look for them. Mm-hmm. We'd love to find one, but we haven't yet. Sure, Paul.
Any evidence of scrounging beams from downtown Chaco by later prehistoric populations?
Well, that's one of the questions I think about that early stuff at Aztec. That sources to the Chuskas, did it come from downtown Chaco? Because, Wajiji was never moved. Maybe those beams were cut from Wajiji and got moved. We don't have any. I don't know, that'd be a question for Lyons, I'll bet. He may have a better insight. I don't think so.
There's no Zuni, which would argue against that, I guess.
Right.
Okay.
Nope. Sure, John.
Yeah, it just strikes me, I think your study's terrific, looking at Strontium and things. I know Brad Vieira published one last year. They planted corn at the slope of the Chuscas, North Gallup, and did compare those cobs chemically to cobs from Chaco, and discovered that, I know there's some debate about this, but it seems like a fair amount of the corn that was consumed in Chaco came from the slopes of the Chuscas. And so I'm wondering if some of this back and forth between different sources of trees may have actually been part of a much larger system of the fruit basket in a sense.
I wouldn't doubt that at all. I lived up there, and the interesting thing I thought was on that slope of the Chuscas, it really depended on the year. Some of those valleys would be incredibly lush because they get, for whatever wind, every rainstorm would hit that valley. And 10 kilometers away, as dry as a bone, you know? So I think there was a lot of hedging with people's bets in that whole area. But that part of it, that southwestern corner of the San Juan Basin is incredibly productive. Right there at Tolokai and you know, sort of south of Nest City to Tolokai, Mexican Springs and stuff like that. It's just great. Sure.
You had estimates of the numbers of trees that went into these sites.
Mm-hmm.
Have you tried to translate that to, given the technology of cutting trees and transporting trees, how many people were required just to move trees?
I think Tom Wines and I think Spig and Wines estimated that. I haven't. I can't remember if in that article that they had anything like that or not. They may have. They may have. I'm sort of leery, especially about stone axe cutting. You know, those sorts of estimates. Because everyone I know who's ever tried to cut down a tree with a stone axe just ended up with bloody knuckles and a lot of cuss words. You know? Well, thank you all very much.